Hey, Scott from Retired.com here.
And Seth from ShrinkingPastor.com.
And Calvin Markwood, their grandfather and father.
And together, the four of us, we are Markwood Men's Breakfast Club. Welcome back once again for part two of our two-part series. Q&A with Retired Colonel Calvin Markwood.
That's right.
Welcome back, Dad.
Thank you. Welcome to my house.
Yeah, how are you doing?
To my film studio. I'm doing great.
So we thought we'd take this opportunity to ask some of the questions that you guys have posed on some of the previous videos. Some of them, they relate to all sorts of things. If you didn't see the last video, we talked about UFOs and talked about how the military is honored and all sorts of things, and we'll jump right into it now.
Well, and those were in response to questions and comments posted on videos that really are scattered out over a couple years.
Yeah.
A couple videos on my channel, the Aristocab channel, a couple videos here. And we'll link as many of those as we can remember to link down in the description below. But we continue on with our questions.
Okay.
So here we go. Ready?
Yep.
You know what, I'm going to jump down to this one about the audio recordings. We had somebody who watches our channel who asked us if you would be interested in listening to, and perhaps even on camera, responding to some audio recordings of, these were control tower recordings that had, you know, some of the communication back and forth between the pilots. And he was kind enough to send those audio recordings on CD. Of course, when I came here on my last visit, I left that CD at home. My wife then tried to rip those and share them with me on Dropbox, and none of that ever worked. But we talked a little bit about this and kind of decided against it. Can you explain to these folks who are watching why we're not recording that recording?
Yeah, because they're really boring.
Okay.
No, the biggest problem with them, there's two problems in my opinion. The biggest one is that not seeing what's going on and not being there, it's really a lot of noise, and there's not a lot of information from it, other than that in some of them you can sense the panic that occasionally was there. And that's the other thing that bothers me about them. One of the important things in flying those missions was to keep the radio as clear as you could, so that really important stuff could get on it. And really important stuff was like listening for the beeper if a guy had to eject from a damaged airplane or something like that, or some warning that MiGs were up and their location. So you really wanted it to be clear. And a well-disciplined flight, you'd hardly ever hear from them, because they'd be flying what they planned to do and not having to do a lot of shouting.
So like in Top Gun, where everybody was just constantly chattering back and forth, that's not...
I was on some missions where it was that noisy, and it was typically just one flight. And I mean, I'm not saying a flight that I could name, but it would be just one out of the 4 or 6 flights that were involved that would be making the noise, and it would be because someone just wanted to talk, I guess.
Were they nervous or...
Who knows? But there'd be questions asked, there'd be comments made that were totally unnecessary to fly the mission, and it would just load it down. So I found it pretty disgusting. The whole thing in Top Gun, where everything had to be repeated twice, was pure Hollywood. Okay, I've never seen that. Only Tom Cruise would ever do something like that. Okay. Actually, those were Navy pilots too, so
maybe they chatter.
Yeah. No, we had some Navy guys up in the north while we were there, and we didn't hear much from them either. We'd see them sometimes.
So thank you for sending that recording along, and we appreciate your desire to, I think, give us a catalyst to have the conversation. I think that was really what was at the heart of that offer. So thank you for that. There was Jeff Allen asked a question about the strafing of a Russian ship that was talked about in the book Thud Ridge.
Yes.
Okay, can you explain that? What that was about? I mean, for somebody who hasn't read the book, I haven't read the book. What's it about?
Well, the strafing there was a mission that was flown up in the northeast part of Hanoi, and to get up there we would fly out over the Gulf. We'd fly across the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam out into the Gulf of Tonkin, and then up north, cross the coast and go inland. And on this particular day, one of the flights was coming back out, and as they got over the water, it was undercast. There were clouds underneath them, and when they were well offshore, gunfire started coming up at them out of the clouds. The guy who was leading the flight, and this is a flight of 4, the guy who was leading it was a guy that I knew quite well. Wasn't a guy that liked to be shot at, so he rolled over and went down through the clouds, saw the ship and saw that they were firing, so he fired back at them and strafed them. According to the news, he killed one Russian sailor on it, and then he headed back home.
Now, technically, we weren't at war with Russia, right?
That's true.
Yeah. Can you explain for folks that maybe haven't paid attention to what was going on in Vietnam?
Yeah, not only Russian, but many nations were taking supplies into North Vietnam at that time, and they were taking them in by ship. There were a lot of supplies that were coming out of China across the border to the north, but these were food and ammunition and who knows what coming in by ship.
And these were communist countries that were supporting...
Not just communist countries.
But they were supporting the communist government in North Vietnam.
Yes, okay. But they were
profiting.
Many countries that were profiting from it. And so they would be in the harbor of Haiphong. We had to be very careful not to attack them, because that would lead to international incidents. And in particular, the Russians were an irritant to us, but they were there and that was part of it. So the guy should not have strafed the ship. They should not have been firing at him, but that's the way it happened that day. Broughton, who wrote Thud Ridge, was not that flight lead. He wasn't even on the flight. He was involved in the cover-up of the incident, the attempted cover-up that failed, and he was dismissed from the Air Force prematurely because of that, as was the guy who actually led the mission to fly it. So that's one of the problems with Broughton's books. They have Broughton's book. It has some whining in it about what happened to his career, and it has some things that were not quite true. I mentioned in one of the other videos that there's an author named Tom Wilson who's written a couple of books. Thud Ridge is one of them, and Lucky's Bridge is another one. Those are good books. They're historical fiction. They really talk about the Wild Weasel mission, the anti-SAM mission. But if you want to read something about what life was like,
Thud Ridge was a good book or bad book?
Good.
Good.
Yeah, Tom Wilson wrote interesting books.
Tom Wilson's Thud Ridge.
No, Tom Wilson is not.
Okay, so
just for clarity.
Thud Ridge was written by Scott Broughton.
Okay, not good. What were the 2 books that Tom Wilson wrote?
He wrote several, but Thud Ridge was one, and Lucky's Bridge was another one.
So same title, Thud Ridge.
No.
Okay, so you're misspeaking.
I'm sorry. I really am, and you should delete all this.
We don't do that.
Now I got to think about what.
Termite Hill?
Termite Hill.
Okay, I read that one.
Yeah, Termite Hill and Lucky's Bridge.
Okay, Termite Hill was really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was about the, what they call them? The river rats, right? Or
well, it was about wild weasels.
Wild weasels.
Yeah, the anti-SAM guys. River rats were all of the F-105 pilots that went across the Red River on missions. Thud Ridge was a ridge in Laos that had a navigation station on top of it, and it was a very narrow ridge, kind of like a loaf of bread turned upside down, and had very, very steep sides, and so they were able to defend it against the North Vietnamese and the Pathet Lao fighters who tried to get it for many years. They eventually were able to get in there and destroy it, but it was our primary navigation station when we came in on missions from the west side of North Vietnam.
So you lost me on an upside down loaf of bread. I suddenly got hungry. And
we're on video, yeah. It was a ridge that was shaped kind of like an inverted wedge, okay?
Okay.
A little bit rounded on the top.
So this is homemade bread. This is not store-bought bread.
Not store-bought bread. That's
Got it. Okay, now I'm with you.
Yeah.
We had a big breakfast, but I haven't had lunch, and so it was just the mention of bread that lost me. Okay, the Pipeless Piper, who asked a question in the last video, asked a question. At what age did your dad's head become so big?
I'm guessing Homer's head has always been this big. But, was that question for me? Or?
I'm not sure which of us you're talking about there, but, you know, for the sake of self-protection, let's say that it was about you.
I assumed he was talking about me, and it really ticked me off. It did for just a minute, and then I got to thinking about where that might have come from. You know, all fighter pilots had egos, of course, and I was what was known as an enigma. An enigma is where you have two things that don't make any sense together, and that was a fighter pilot who thinks. Okay, and that was a joke within the fighter pilot community, primarily brought about by guys in the back seat who were radar operators and so forth. But I had a disadvantage and an advantage going into the 105. My disadvantage was that most of the guys that flew it had flown it for 5 or 8 years in Europe and were well familiar with the airplane and with the way they had planned to fly it had we had World War III over in Europe. That was different from flying it in Vietnam, and there was a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of things done wrong because they carried that stuff along with them. The other advantage that I had was that I had 6 years of engineering education before I became a 105 pilot, and I had a lot of math and a lot of airplane physics and so forth. So I was able to understand why an airplane did what it did, and how to use it differently, and differently from what I was taught when I went through 105 training and from what they were teaching when I got to the base. And there were things like when you're going to join up with the tanker. A typical fighter pilot looks out there with his 20/20 vision and he sees this black speck in the sky, and he immediately adds power and points his nose toward it and starts chasing it to close in on it. By the time you get to the tanker with a flight of 4 and each of you carrying 6 750-pound bombs on, you're going 200 knots faster than the tanker is, and you're crossing it at about a 60-degree angle, and so it's speed brakes and everybody trying to slow down and get back information. I understood the geometry of the tanker join up, where you would get it dead ahead at 7 miles, start a 30-degree bank turn, and that would put you right in behind it exactly where you needed to be. And so my squadron commander says, "You never miss a tanker join up." And he said, "How do you do that?" And I didn't want to tell him because he was one of those old dyed-in-the-wool fighter pilots. And I used radar when I did it, and good fighter pilots didn't turn the radar on.
Really?
Yeah.
Was that an ego thing?
They didn't ever have to use it in the day mission. You didn't have to use it. You could use it in a day mission. And I really got good with the radar flying the night low altitude missions in particular when we were.
So that's like using your GPS when you know where you're going.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. Yeah. Tells you when you're going to get there and that you're on the right track.
Yeah.
So, yes, I had a big head. I felt like I did some things different and better than the majority of them did. We had a situation where the guys were complaining that the 3,000-pound bombs were duds, that about half of them seemed to fail to go off when they hit the ground. So I got together with the wing weapons officer who was scratching his head over this, and we looked at some of the fuse specifications for them. And if you look, you'd set it to fuse 4 seconds after it left the airplane, or 6 seconds after it left the airplane, to keep it from blowing you up if it went off right then. And it turns out that the fuses weren't made for 6 seconds. They were made to go somewhere between about 2 and 10 seconds, okay, on a bell-shaped curve probability. So the guys who were trying to get down lower and get more accurate with the bombs, releasing were actually, the bombs were hitting the ground before they were intended to go off, just because of the way they were done.
So if a bomb hits the ground without the fuse, it doesn't go off?
It makes a big hole in the ground. It buries in the ground. In Germany, they're still finding bombs that didn't go off from World War II.
Right.
Okay. So if your bomb doesn't fuse, good chance that it will not detonate.
Huh.
Okay. Because they're tough. Okay. And the fuses were there to make them detonate, of course. So again, my engineering background helped me to understand the details of that, and most of the guys couldn't, including the wing weapons officer. So
big head.
So big head. Yeah, I don't apologize for that.
So a little bit more about you and your career. After you were a pilot, you were only a pilot. I hate to say it, you were only in Thailand flying missions over Vietnam for how long total?
About 11 months.
11 months. Yeah. And your career with the Air Force was how long?
25 years.
25 years. So you did a lot more than really what we've spent our time talking about here. This is exciting stuff.
Yeah.
What did you do after coming back to the U.S.? What sort of...
Well, I had a couple of non-flying gaps, or non-flying periods in my career. After I had my wings and was in the 1st Fighter Squadron, Air Defense Command Interceptor Squadron out in California, I went to graduate school for 2 years, and then after that I went to a satellite program office out in California and worked on the first Air Force weather satellite. And this was back in the early 60s when the Air Force didn't have the mission of satellites at all, of weather satellites. But I got to work on that. So I was involved in launch vehicles and in the satellite design. I wasn't involved in designing it, but I was knowledgeable of that. And got to do that for 2.5 years. We launched about 7 satellites at that time. And in fact, the satellite that we used in Vietnam to get weather just before we'd go into the target was one of ours that we put up there especially for that. It was one that could be read out directly as it flew over North Vietnam at 450 miles up and would tell us what the weather was right over the Hanoi area. And that was pretty neat. So
how long after Sputnik are we talking about here?
I was in pilot training in the mid-50s when Sputnik went up, 58.
So we're
talking
5 years later. We're putting satellites up ourselves that are actually doing something besides beeping. And
yeah, this satellite was about that big around and about that thick, and was quite crude and small compared to what we do now, of course. From there, I went to 105 training and then to Vietnam. When I came back, I went to Washington, D.C., to Air Force Systems Command Headquarters, and I was in a group called Development Plans and Analysis. Development Plans was the group that looked way out in the future to see what kind of systems we needed. And when I got there, they had a bunch of programs that they were pushing called the BX, the FX, the AX, the MX, and the CX. And you recognize the BX as the B1 many years later, the FX is the F-15, the AX became the F-10, the CX became the C-117. That took about 25 years from early planning to where it finally started flying. And the MX was the Peacekeeper missile. So this was in the gestation period for those, and I was involved in that. One of the things that I did while I was there was there was an evaluation that was going on to upgrade the B-66, which we used in Vietnam for electronic warfare, for a jamming airplane. And I had come back from Vietnam with a very low opinion of the value of that kind of jamming, where the jamming airplane sets back out of the battle area and the fighters go in and the guys attack them. And they're trying to jam the radars that are tracking the airplanes, and it's like trying to blind a guy by shining a flashlight in his ear. So I got to write a report for the general that was several layers above me on the value of this EB-66 modernization program, and the general put a bullet in it. And so that was the kind of stuff that we did. Other things I was able to help push a little bit. I went from there to the Pentagon in a very similar kind of a function there. It was another analysis group that did future weapon system analysis, and that was interesting and a lot of fun too. From there I went to War College for a year, and then to Wright-Patterson, where I was the director of the flight simulator program office when in the mid-70s, when the fuel crisis hit, and the Air Force said we can't fly as much as we want to fly, and we got to keep people trained, so we needed new flight simulators. And so the program office that I ran had 18 simulators being developed, 18 different simulators being developed for every airplane and flying function that we had in the Air Force.
So we saw the old, I guess it was the Link, the original simulator.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it looked like a ride you would put a quarter in.
Yeah.
And it was a little miniature airplane with wings, which the pilot doesn't even see because he's inside of a little shell. What was the date of that?
Oh, World War II.
Really?
Yeah.
And so in the 70s, you guys were you were doing some stuff that was like the movie Star Wars, where you were working with models that were under cameras, and whoever was in the simulator was actually seeing footage superimposed over the land moving beneath them and so on.
Yes. We had simulators, research simulators at that time that some of our labs at Wright-Patterson and some of the contractors were working on to give you a full wraparound visual system. I'm talking about like TV tubes packed all the way around your head. One of them that was out at Luke Field was two F-4 cockpits. They each had one of these visual systems on it, and it had cameras with F-4 models, and you essentially could dogfight. It was called the Simulator for Air-to-Air Combat, and you could actually dogfight in it. It was really crude. We were learning things about people and the way they worked, and if the visual system lagged what the airplane was supposed to be doing, and the lag came from just the electronics having to have time to function and do the calculations and everything, and display it. If it lagged by a very, very small amount, and the scientists were actually measuring what that amount was, you could induce nausea, and I'm serious about nausea. The simulators had motion systems on them too, and if there was a difference between the visual and the motion and what the pilot thought he was doing, you could really get a guy sick. But they were tremendous trainers, and they were giving us a promise of things to come. So we were building simulators for the B-52, the KC-135, F-15, F-16 was just in development at the time, T-37, T-38, C-130, I think that's all of them that we had going there. Some of them were part task trainers. The guys at Wright-Pat in one of the labs built one using a damaged section of a KC-135, the tail end that had the operator station, and a model of the boom, the refueling boom with a camera on it, and a model of the airplane receiver, and using that to train boom operators, called the boom operator part task trainer. It worked so well that a young lady airman who was one of the technicians on it went through all of the testing phase, where we were running hours and hours and hours on it to make sure that the stuff was not only working right, but that it was going to be durable enough. And then she went out to Castle Air Force Base when we shipped it out there and actually refueled airplanes.
Straight from the simulator?
Yeah, straight from the simulator, yeah. No, she went into a tanker, and on the first
flight. Right, but I'm saying having moved straight from the simulator into an actual...
Yeah. So we had one down at other Air Force base, training base down south of Phoenix, Williams Air Force Base. At that time was a T-37 base, and they had another research simulator down there that was T-37 cockpits. We converted one of the cockpits to an A-10 cockpit and set it up to do air-to-ground weapon training, air-to-ground bombing and gunnery training, and the guys that went through that in the first trial class were dropping scoreable bombs on their first mission And the instructor said, ain't no way. So that was really, really satisfying. I went from there over to the F-16 program office then and spent 3.5 years there as the deputy. And this was right at the beginning of the production run of the F-16. We had 6 countries that were getting the airplanes, and we activated a base on each of the 6 countries in 6 months, 6 bases in 6 months. So, and of course, General Dynamics was cranking out airplanes at a tremendous rate at that time. So that was an excellent.
And I guess I should have watched our videos because it's been so long, and I'm wondering if we've even talked about this in the past. But I remember one incident in particular where I want to say it was a DC-10 crashed in Chicago because an engine fell off. And through the research you discovered that the bolt that had failed was being used on the F-16, or had been, or was suspected, or something was going on, and you didn't have answers yet. What was that situation?
Yeah, it wasn't related to that airline accident. Actually, what we found with the bolt problem was a technician in the GD factory was torquing. There were 4 bolts that held a plate on each side of the fuselage that had a stud that went into the sides of the engine. And those 2 plates and those 2 studs, plus one at the front of the engine, is what held the engine in the F-16. And in the middle of the night, this guy's torquing one of those 4 bolts, and it snapped off. And he says, something's wrong. So they checked the bolt, and sure enough, it failed right at the head. And got to inspecting the bolts and found that about 10% of the bolts that they had in the bins there had stress cracks right in the head. And they quickly checked to see how that could have happened. And the way these bolts are made was from a long rod. They would heat the end of it, put it into a press that would upset it and put a knob on it, and then quench that in order they quenched it in oil to cool it slowly enough to where it wouldn't crack and wouldn't be brittle, and then they would cut it off and machine it. And they did that then bolt after bolt after bolt down this long rod, 10 or so of them off of each rod of iron, of steel. Turned out that the manufacturer was cutting the first one off. It was called a setup bolt. He'd cut the first one off and water quench it to cool it down fast. Then they'd machine it and make sure that the machine was set up right, okay, and machining correctly. And then they would stamp it as with an X on the head and throw it in the trash. Okay. Well, this contractor decided that he could make 10% more profit by throwing those bolts into the box instead of into the trash. So at that time, as the deputy, I was in charge while the general, who was the program director, was in Egypt selling airplanes and flying MiGs. I won't tell you who that was, but I got a phone call from the factory telling me about the problem, and said, we don't know how many of those are out in the field and which airplanes might have them. So I had to ground the fleet at that time, and that was a very serious thing.
How many airplanes?
Oh, at that time, probably in the 500 or so range.
In 6 different countries.
And Tactical Air Command in the United States forced our general, never liked it when someone grounded his airplane.
And you don't announce this on ABC News either,
yes,
right? Hey, all of our planes are grounded.
So what they did then was they had to go through in the factory, and in both the factory where they made them and where GD where they were using them, and inspect all those bolts. They X-ray inspected them, and by Monday morning we had all of the ones replaced in the airplanes. They literally took all the bolts out, put them back in the airplanes. These are the ones again that held the engine.
Yeah.
So we got through that long, difficult weekend, got them flying again, and about 9 o'clock on the next Friday morning, a week later, my phone rings, and it's the deputy down at GD, and he says, "Cal, you sitting down?" And I said, "Yeah," and he says, "The bolts that hold the flight control actuators, the bolts that hold the wings on, are made by the same guy the same way."
Oh gosh.
So then we grounded the fleet again.
Oh.
And in that case, a quick analysis said, there's 10 bolts that hold each actuator on. Chances that one of them would fail won't hurt the airplane, so we could take the time. and there's a bazillion bolts that hold the wing on, same answer, you know, so with a little bit of analysis and common sense, we're able to get them back flying fast. 3 people from that company went to prison, as well they should have.
Mm.
So that was the story about the bolt.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna have to go and do some Googling and see why in my little probably 15-year-old or 14-year-old brain, why I connected that with the bolt failures on the
engine.
The engine with the DC-10.
Yeah,
Maybe that was the same timing.
It may have been.
I mean, it captured my curiosity about fasteners.
Yeah.
Because years later, as I was selling fasteners, I understood that, you know, there were accidents at carnivals and, you know, construction sites.
Who knows?
Counterfeit Chinese bolts were
Sure.
born in from China, and it was interesting to me, scary, I guess, to me, that things like that could happen. You know, you grow up with there's bolts in the car. If one of them breaks, no big deal. You pull off the side of the road. But
Yeah.
there are certain applications where those are.
You're up a tree.
Yeah, those are critical. All right. Well, this went away from our script, but I was just curious about that. And it actually doesn't, because it all goes to your big head.
Yes.
Because you did accomplish a lot, and my goodness, you even moved on from there. But beyond the Air Force, you worked at Martin Marietta.
Martin Marietta at that time became Lockheed Martin before I retired. Yeah.
But how long did you work there?
I worked there for 18 years. Yeah, you
Wow.
said 20-something.
Did I say 20?
Yeah, you had that answer in there.
Oh, well, maybe I did.
That's
But that's a
you're
whole nother.
forgiven.
That's a whole nother video.
Yeah.
But you know, there's an old saying, a variation, because I can't remember the real saying, that says it's not bragging if you can do it.
Yeah.
So, you know, if he's got a big head, trust me, it's because he can do it. All right. Well, thank you for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any more questions or comments or cheap shots for my dad, certainly leave those comments below. We will link to those videos that we talked about previously. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your time, Dad. We appreciate
Thank you for your time. Glad you're here.
spending time with us. So, all right. That's it. Make it a great week.
Yeah.